All right, well, good morning, everyone. If you weren't here last week, we started a three-part series on why Christians should support Israel. So this is week 2 of that. Last week, I laid out a scriptural case. What does the Bible say about why Christians should support Israel? Today will be more of a history lesson than a sermon, okay? And really, today, I'm not so much talking about why Christians should support Israel as why everybody should support Israel. Because really, everybody should be supporting Israel. There's really no reason not to. And so, we got a lot to cover today, so I'm going to get right into it. If you're listening by podcast, you probably don't have to go to 1.25, because I think I'll be flying. Here we go. Zionism and anti-Zionism. This is really what we're talking about, the core of what we're talking about. The state of Israel, does it have the right to exist? And so the definitions to get us started. Zionism is the view that the state of Israel has the right to exist and Jews have a right to return to their homeland. Anti-Zionism is the view that the state of Israel does not have the right to exist and Jews have no right to return to or live in the Holy Land. Pretty stark contrast. I support Zionism. I reject anti-Zionism, and we're going to talk about why today. You have no doubt heard over the last couple of years and maybe before in particular from the left. Now, I made a statement last week that there are two primary accusations against the Jewish people in our modern times. One is kind of originating from the political left, and one is originating from the political right. The one from the left is the one we're talking about today. And you've heard them in protests and so forth, no doubt, say things like, from the river to the sea, which is a way of saying that the entire Holy Land, from the Jordan River all the way to the Mediterranean Sea, belongs to the Arabs, and no Jewish state should exist there. They would have no problem wiping out the entire Jewish population, as if it's not already been tried. You've heard people say, globalize the intifada. In other words, the organized terrorist campaigns by the Palestinian Arabs against Jews in Israel, that's called intifada, that should be expanded worldwide so that we're persecuting the Jews worldwide and committing terrorist acts against them. Well, these are ridiculous statements, but these are coming out of the mouths of people today. Not just a few people, but many people. All right, this worldview, I want to kind of give you the basis here, the axioms of the worldview, two axioms in particular, as it relates to Israel. Two axioms of this worldview that are invalid. The first one is this: the world is made up exclusively of colonizer-colonized and oppressor-oppressed relationships. In other words, these people that believe this way view everything through the lens of who is the victim. Everything is viewed through the lens of who is the victim. And whoever's not the victim is right. Now, you have to feel for these people, because the only way that this kind of view is going to come about is because there are actual victims. And so you feel for these, how many people it is, half the planet, who view it this way. They have at some point been the victim of something, truly. And that's bad. It's called a fallen world and a cursed world, and we live in that world, and it's not good. And that's why we gravitate to our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, to fix that. They gravitate to victim mindset. And so everything is viewed in the lens of the victim, and whoever's not the victim is right. And that's not a biblical stance. It's not a healthy stance. You can't ever get healthy with that stance. The second axiom is that the indigenous peoples, whoever they are, have a special right to self-govern and even throw off or overthrow colonizers or oppressors. Now, this also has not been the the state of affairs in the history of the planet. Again, the world is broken. We have wars. We have all kinds of things that go on over centuries of time that are not good, and people are mistreated. In other words, eggs are scrambled. You can't go back hundreds of years later and try to unscramble those eggs. What we do is we take what's here today and we try to do the best we can with it today. But these two axioms are driving this, and they're not right and they're not biblical. Then they will insert Israel into this paradigm, and they'll say Israel is a colonizer. We're going to find out if that's true or not. And since Israel is a colonizer, by extension, Israel maintains an aggressor or oppressor role. Do not believe that those things are true, and I'm going to try to show that today. Let's start with the colonizer accusation. We're going to debunk this idea that Israel is the role of the colonizer. Let's evaluate. If you have two peoples who have a claim to a territory, how would you evaluate whose claim is stronger? Whose claim is more valid? Well, I've identified 6 areas that you could check and you could measure. Ethnicity, name, religion, language, culture, sovereignty. What do I mean by that? Ethnicity. How far back can each people trace its DNA in the region? Name. How long has each name been applied to each people group? How about how long has the religion of the people been enforced? How about the language? How long has each people used their language? How about the culture? How much of a trajectory of culture has been sustained over the course of time in that region? And then finally, have there ever been any sovereign states in that region before now? And so let's look at these questions and see excuse me, how the two peoples stack up. The people of Israel took over the Holy Land in 1406 BC. Joshua entered the Promised Land and began to, at God's orders, and began to take that land. Some people say that it's a little more recent than that. They put the date in the 1200s rather than in 1406. For our purposes, it doesn't matter, because either way, they came before the Philistines. The word Palestine is etymologically related to Philistine. When you say Palestine, etymologically, you're relating back to the Philistines. The Philistines came to that land from overseas through the Mediterranean Sea, and they arrived after the Israelis came into the Promised Land, about 3,200 years ago. So if you trace DNA back to the Philistines, now there are Palestinians today who have, there's quite a bit of DNA. Now we have DNA, so we can see where these people came from, right? There's quite a bit of DNA evidence of Palestinians tracing back to the Philistines. Obviously, the Israelis trace back to, all the Jews trace back to Israel, who's 4,000 years ago. In other words, Jacob. But here's the thing. The Israelis came to the land before the Palestinians. Who was the only people, if you want to talk about an indigenous people, who's the only people that predate the Jews in Israel? The Canaanites. The Canaanites. Nobody's arguing for a Canaanite state. Okay? That's the only people that predate Israel in that region. Okay? Now, it's actually true that there are a pretty good percentage of Palestinians that have Canaanite DNA. But here's the deal. There's also a pretty high percentage of Jews who have Canaanite DNA. So by ethnicity, Israel was there first. What about the name? Well, we just talked about the name Israel. That's Jacob, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob's name was changed to Israel. That name has been around for 4,000 years. This name has been around in the region for 3,431 years. In other words, since 1406 BC. The name Palestine, and I'm being very generous here, traces back to 136 BC. When I say I'm being generous, it's because that name Palestine was applied to the region. In other words, it was a geographical term, not applied to the people. In fact, in the early 1900s, the early 20th century, they talked about Palestine. They would talk about Palestine again as a geographical area. And so you would have Palestinian Jews, Palestinian Arabs, Palestinian Christians. In other words, it was the geography. It was not applied to a people group, to an ethnicity, really until about the middle of the last century. When you're talking about this is a name applied to a people group. But let's go all the way back to 136 AD. What happened right there? It was the second major dispersal of the Jews. You remember that in AD 70, there was a huge takeout, and they leveled Jerusalem, and they dispersed the Jews in AD 70. There was another similar occurrence in 135 and 136 AD. The Emperor Hadrian of Hadrian's Wall fame really made it his goal to completely remove the Jews from the Holy Land completely. And he almost did it. It was really down to just a couple of towns of just a few people. There were not very many Jews left after Hadrian got done with that extermination and eradication and all of that. And so when that happened, and they kicked almost all the Jews out of the Holy Land, Emperor Hadrian decided to call that land Palestine, Palestina, as an insult to the Jews. This was your home, but now we're going to call it something completely different, and to try to separate, even by the name of the land, the Jews from their own homeland. Now we're going to call it something else to make it even harder for you to be able to trace back to here. That goes all the way back to 136 AD. The religion. You know, Ishmael, where the Arabs trace, Ishmael was not Muslim. Hello. The religion of Islam does not come about until the 600s AD. And in the 636, 637 AD, and culminating in 638, the Muslim Arabs take over the Holy Land. And that's where the religion of Islam can trace, how far back the religion can trace in that area. The religion of Judaism has been there much longer. How about the language? They have been speaking Hebrew for all that time. They've only been speaking Arabic in that area for about 1,200 years. What about the culture? The culture came about 200 years later and began to dig in and take root. And so in every measure you can measure, Israel has a more valid claim than Palestine. There have been 3 sovereign states in that region besides the current state of Israel. There was the kingdom of Israel, there was the split kingdom of Israel and Judah, and then there was the nation state that the Jews had after the return, the exile. Every state that has ever been in that region has been a Jewish state. There has never been a Palestinian state or any other kind of state in that region other than Jewish. So clearly, in terms of an indigenous people, it's the Jews. They have the greater claim. You're talking about colonization. Let's really talk about who colonized whom. Again, in the 630s, the Muslim Arabs conquered the Holy Land and rule. And there's no better, if I can use that word, colonizers than the Muslim Arabs. Lightning speed and able to take over so much territory. If you want to talk about colonization, let's talk about them. That's really the true colonizers of that region. Because again, before 630, there was no such thing as Islam. And now it's all over not only that area, but the entire globe. For 1,000, now they took over and they only ruled for 23 years because people kept taking over that area. That area changed hands in terms of power structure and who was in charge, changed hands over and over and over for the next 1,000 years. Egyptians, Turks, Persians, Sudanese, all kinds of people ruled that area. And at no point was there a Palestinian state, quote unquote, where the quote unquote Palestinians, who didn't exist, because that name was not referred to in a people group until the 20th century. There was no state where they ruled themselves. It was all different peoples. From 1517 to 1917, you have the Ottoman Empire. So when World War I rolls around, the Ottoman Empire has been in power for 400 years in the Holy Land. And so the Jews and the Arabs are under the rule of the Ottoman Empire when the British take over in 1917 after World War I. Let's talk about displacement. Part of the argument for colonization is your people displaced my people. Well, let's see if that's true. The immigration of Jews back to the Holy Land began in 1881. There were very few. In fact, there were about 30,000 Jews in that region prior to that. And they began in 1881 and on up to the establishment of the State of Israel and beyond, began to immigrate back to the homeland. And so they did come in large numbers over that period before the State of Israel was established. But they did not displace the Arabs who were there. In fact, there were more Arabs population increase during those years than there was Jewish population increase. Population increased from about 30,000 to 630,000 of Jewish people, an increase of 600,000 in the years 1880 to 1947. But the Arab population increased from 400,000 roughly to over 1 million. And so they also increased by over 600,000. So the idea that Jews are just taking over their land is ridiculous. Not only that, but the Jews were intentional about purchasing and settling in unoccupied, undesirable land. They took the land that nobody else wanted. They would take swampy land, and they had the know-how to bring their farming know-how and so forth to cultivate that land. And so they made the land into a better place when they came. But they certainly did not displace the Arabs. Now, when the first Arab-Israeli war happened in 1948, the Israeli army did go in and occupy 2 cities and displace the Arab population of those 2 cities. That is true. Okay? But I'm talking about a widespread, this idea that the Jews came in and just erased the population. It's nonsense. It's nonsense. Part of Zionism, or the claim against, part of anti-Zionism, the claim against Zionism is that it is a quote-unquote white movement. And so part of the worldview of these people, these anti-Zionists, is really they're anti-white. White people, bad, is part of the game. And of course, that is not a biblical position. The biblical position is all people bad. All people need Savior. Okay? All people need Savior. And so anyway, this is part of it, though. In fact, there are claims nowadays for a complete genocide of the white population worldwide. I'm telling you, it's crazy. So what's true about this in terms of the Jews? Well, the Jews were dispersed from their homeland. And they went to many different places. There are Jews in China, there are Jews in India, there are Jews all over the place. And of course, many went to Europe. Those who settled in Europe were persecuted or expelled or exterminated precisely because they were not white. You're not like us, you're different, is what the Europeans were saying. Well, I'm sorry, you can't have it both ways. You can't kick the Jews out of Europe for not being white and then not let them into the homeland because they are white. You can't have it both ways. The Jews have the DNA of Israel. They have the name of Israel and the identity of Israel. They have the Jewish religion. They have some, they've certainly adapt to culture and assimilate in some cases, but they have still the religious, cultural piece of Judaism. Also, many Jews from non-European countries have returned and are returning. There is a current push in Israel. They are basically running drills to try to accommodate in an emergency situation to bring Jews from all over the world, thousands and thousands of Jews from all over the world to come and populate the country of Israel because of this anti-Jew ideology that's rampant in our day today. And there is a current plan for Jews of India. I think about 1,000 Jews who currently live in India will be returning to the homeland. And shocker, guess what they look like? They look like Indians. You know? So, no, Zionism is not a white movement. It is a movement for Jews to be able to return to their homeland if they want to. And so it has nothing to do with white. There's another claim that Israel is an apartheid state. This is so ridiculous, it's not even funny. But did you know 20% of Israel's population is not Jewish, mostly Arab. And they have all the rights of every citizen, including the right to vote. They have the right to the same health care as anybody else. Okay? There are Arabs and others in Israel who have all the quote-unquote best jobs. They work as doctors. They work as pharmacists. They hold seats in the Congress. There are Arabs in the Israeli Congress. There are Arabs in the Israeli Supreme Court. You got to be kidding me. Apartheid state, that's an insult to black South Africans. This is Israel is about as good of an example as you can have of not an apartheid state. They even have Arabs and others that serve in the IDF, which is the Israeli Defense Forces. In other words, the army. They have non-Jewish people serving in their army. So, I think we can very boldly say, no, the Jews are not the role of colonizer in this situation. Number one, they have the strongest claim in terms of being an indigenous people on every measure, every metric you can measure. If you're going to talk about colonization, you got to talk about the Muslim Arabs in the 630s if you really want to talk about what does colonialism look like. Number three, at no point in the past 3,400 plus years has there ever been zero Jews. In other words, they've had a continuous presence in the land for 3,400 plus years. At no point has there ever been a sovereign Palestinian state or any other kind of state other than Jewish in that region. The Jews did not displace the Arabs. Zionism is not a white movement, and Israel is not an apartheid state. Okay, so if the Jews are not colonizers, that brings us to the second claim, which is that they are aggressors or oppressors. Are the Jews the aggressor or the oppressor in this relationship? Well, the answer is clearly no, and I'm going to go through that now for the rest of the time. Let's talk about before 1948. So the Jewish state was established in 1948. What about before that? I talked about how the Jews began to immigrate back in 1881. From that time, from 1881 to 1947, there were organized riots and massacres of Jews by Arabs, regularly repeated offensive terroristic behavior, including murder, rape, looting, and arson, before 1948. Now, why is this important? Because the claim is, if we could just get rid of Israel, there wouldn't be any violence. In other words, if we get rid of the state of Israel. No, this was happening before the state of Israel. If we could just have a two-state solution, if there just wasn't any Israel there. No, I'm sorry. This was going on before the state of Israel was in existence. Well, was there any Jewish violence? And I do want to try to be, if I can say it this way, fair. But here's the thing. To be fair and balanced is to call it the way it is, which is that overwhelmingly, the Jews are on the side of good and right. So that's the fair and balanced position. But yes, there have been some, over the years, Jewish violence, some of which is condemned and was not considered good. But in this time period, Jewish response was largely defensive, some retaliatory, some preemptive, comparatively little, in comparison, far less of this kind of behavior from the Jews that could even possibly be considered aggressive or terroristic at this time. Okay, let's get into the state of Israel now and background to that. Beginning in 1897, we have to start with this fellow by the name of Theodor Herzl. He is the one who formally launches the modern Zionist movement. 1897 in Europe. He is recognizing anti-Semitism in his setting, and it's bad. And so he is really the voice that begins this movement of the move back to the homeland, and the idea that the Jews should be able to have a land that they can call their own. 1914, the Ottoman Empire, we talked about them. The Ottoman Turks enter World War I, and they enter in alliance with Germany, and in other words, against Britain and against Russia. Well, this didn't go well for them because the British beat their socks off. Okay, if you really want to lay the blame for the modern state of affairs in that region, you need to lay the blame at the Ottomans. If they would have not entered the war, chances are they'd still be over this region now. But they did. They decided to go to war against Russia in the north, and they were against Britain in the southwest. And Britain beat them and took over the Holy Land in 1917, 1918. Around that time, the British, I just realized that you know how you can make each point go like one at a time? And it's just doing the whole screen. I just realized that. So that's okay. I can work with it. Okay, so in 1917, the British made a policy statement. It's called the Balfour Declaration. And this is it. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. In other words, they're saying, we recognize that the Jews have a right, a claim, this is their homeland, and they have a right to be there, and we are saying that we will help them to do that. We're also saying that we're not going to do anything to affect the rights of the other peoples in that region. You can substitute the word Arabs there. In other words, we want them to be able to have rights as well. We're not going to do anything to change that. And if there are Jews other places in the world, we're not saying they have to come to the Holy Land. We're just saying they get to. And so that was the policy in 1917. In 1922, the League of Nations basically gave a thumbs up to that policy. And they give Britain the legal or official mandate. In other words, they are administrating over not just the region of Palestine, which I'm going to try not to use the word Palestine anymore. I'm going to call it the Holy Land or the Promised Land or something like that. The land between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. They had not only control over that area, but many other areas, including Transjordan, which is now Jordan. And part of that mandate was that they recognized the Balfour Declaration. Well, fast forward about 15 years, and Britain they don't own the land, they're just administrating, and they're trying to figure out what to do. And 15 years later, they have what is called the Peel Commission, which is sent to research and try to figure out what's going on in this area and how best can we deal with it. And they come back and they say that the League of Nations mandate is not working. In particular, the Arabs really don't like this situation. And so we need something different. And they give the first partition plan. This is the first two-state solution. This is the first partition plan where we say the Jews will get this area and the Arabs will get this area. And this is the map of that partition plan. Now, I want you to see that little orange space at the top. That orange space at the top is the original piece of land that the British said was reasonable for the Jews to have. Now, back in 1922, they were talking about giving them all of Palestine and Jordan, which is excessive. But by 1937, now they're going to give them this little orange piece. That little orange piece is roughly the size of Campbell County, Bedford County, Amherst County, and Appomattox County combined. 4 counties, and that's going to be all the land of the entire world that we're going to allow the Jews to have. And the Palestinians rejected it. Not only rejected the borders, they rejected the idea of a partition plan. In other words, we will not allow them to have any sovereign state. Is this interesting? 28% of you think it's interesting. We'll pray for the other 72%. 2 years later, in 1939, Britain issues the 1939 White Paper, which basically reverses all they did with the Balfour Declaration. They said, we're only going to allow 75,000 Jews over a 5-year period, so 15,000 people a year. In 1939, now what's going on in 1939? At the time that the Jews needed it the most, to be able to go somewhere that they could be saved, Britain is saying we're only going to allow 15,000 people a year for 5 years. And after that, you'll have to have Arab consent, which means there won't be any more immigration after that period. And they called for a state that was Arab majority and no Jewish state. So they completely reversed. Now, who's in charge of this? A fellow by the name of Neville Chamberlain. It rings a couple bells for a couple people from history class. Neville Chamberlain is the one who famously had the policy of appeasement. He appeased Hitler. Hitler would do something and he'd say, okay, you can have that, but not anymore. And then Hitler would do something, okay, you can have that, but not anymore. Well, he's doing the same things with the Arabs. Okay, you can have that, but not anymore. In other words, he's giving them the moon. Why? Because he doesn't want to go to war. He's about to go to war, and he doesn't want to drag the Arabs into it. So for political reasons, he sides against the Jews. 1939 to 1945, we get World War II and the Holocaust. It is, I almost feel like I need to apologize for only doing one little bullet point here and only talking about this for just a second, because it's really not the larger thing of what I'm going for. But I have to say, obviously, the worst atrocity, not only to the Jewish people, but in the history of the planet to any peoples. 6 million people exterminated. And not just exterminated, but tortured, treated awfully, starved, and hair used as pillow stuffers, and skin used as lampshades. And how dare people in our day try to minimize this and say it didn't really happen and it was only 200,000, or how dare you? That is a demonic idea that has surfaced. Well, that was a long time ago, and well, we can't. Yeah, you can prove it. They didn't have AI back then. They couldn't fake those videos. After the war, Britain had 2 years to try to figure out what was going on in the Holy Land. And by the end of that, they said, we give up. This is an awful mess, and we don't want to have it anymore. So they turned it back over to the UN. That was when it starts to get interesting. So if you weren't interested before, now you can get interested. when the UN takes back over the idea of what do we do with this land, this is what the map of Israel looks like. First of all, there is no Israel right now. There's just this land. The blue areas are Jewish land owning and settlements, and the green areas are Palestinian Arab land owning and settlements. First thing I want you to notice is the bottom triangle, the bottom white triangle where there's nobody there. That's because that's a desert. So the idea that we would have a map with that whole area, and we try to say, oh, look at this, all this land we used to have. No, nobody had that land. Nobody wanted to be there. It was a desert, okay? And so I want you to see how these settlements, this is where people actually lived in 1947. This is the partition plan that the UN came up with. It looks pretty good, doesn't it? It maps pretty well to those areas. Where there are Arab populations, they said this will be an Arab state. In other words, the red part. Where there are Jewish populations, there will be a Jewish state. And they also gave them, the Jewish people, the lion's share of the desert. Oh, whoop-de-doo. Okay? All right. So the red and white is the UN partition plan. Well, shocker. Arabs rejected that plan. All right, now, this fella is one of the current leaders of the Arab population. He's holding up this famous map, the 4 maps. You may have seen this before, but if not, I'm showing you this because I'm showing you that this is a propaganda tool. He's showing a picture of 4 maps, and now I'm going to show you these 4 maps. They're in the top left corner of your screen. These 4 green maps is what he's holding up. And when you look at these maps, they're designed for you to say, this is what used to be Palestine, and look at how over the years Israel just keeps taking more and more, and now we almost have nothing. Look at how unfair this is. Oh world, weep for us, it's so unfair. It's propaganda. The true maps are in the bottom right corner. They're the ones we just looked at. Look at the first map. You have the Jewish settlements, you have the Palestinian settlements. Most of it is white area. In other words, there's nobody living there. To claim that all of this was Palestinian land is ridiculous. Most of it was uninhabited land. You can see it clearly. Okay? Secondly, they say on the map, this is Palestine, as if this was their country. They didn't have a country. There has never been a Palestinian state. Never, ever. That's called propaganda. Then you look at the second map, which is identical, except it still says Palestine. It's not Palestine. It is an area that was determined by the UN. This could be your territory, but they rejected it. We'll come back to this map a little bit later. May 14th, 1948, the state of Israel is born. British mandate expires. David Ben-Gurion becomes the first prime minister of Israel. He declares independence here in this picture. Theodore Herzl's portrait hangs above as David Ben-Gurion declares independence May 14th, 1948. When he did so, they did that with agreeing to the borders set by the UN. Now, just take a couple extra minutes, but I got to tell this story. Pause. Pause for just a moment. Now let's go back to 1905. 1905, an American Jew and an American Gentile met. They were businessmen. They were traveling businessmen. They met and kind of developed a little bit of a relationship. Later on, they met again. They were in World War I together. They were soldier buddies. And they really became friends. And after World War I, they went back home and they started a business together. A men's store, a haberdashery. and a Jew businessman and a Gentile businessman went into business together in Kansas City after World War I. And they became good friends. And after they gave up the business and they went their separate ways for a couple decades, they had occasion to meet again in 1948 when the Jewish businessman walked into the White House. Jewish businessman's name has been lost to the side notes of the annals of history. His name's Eddie Jacobson. The man he was going to see that day in 1948 in the White House, his friend, the Gentile businessman, was Harry S. Truman. And the Jewish businessman went to the friend, Gentile businessman, and he said, "We need this. The Jewish people need this." And President Truman was kind of in between a rock and a hard place, because politically there were some other decisions that could have been better for him. But his friend helped convince him to recognize the state of Israel. And after David Ben-Gurion declared independence, 11 minutes after the Declaration of Independence, the United States became the first country to recognize Israel as a sovereign state. I am just naive enough to believe that God blessed that. Say what you want about the last 77 years. This country has been enormously blessed. And I'm just naive enough to say that there's at least a little bit of cause and effect there. Now that we have the state of Israel beginning in 1948, the pattern of Arab aggression continues. They could have just said, well, this hasn't gone very well for us, but let's just sit around for a while and see what happens. Maybe it'll get better. But no, they immediately attacked. 5 countries attacked. In 1948, 1949, we get the first Arab-Israeli war. Israel defended itself with virtually no allies, and Israel won decisively, driving back the enemies and gaining territory. And now we get to the third map, because if they'd have just left well enough alone and agreed to the UN borders, they wouldn't have ended up with the third map. Israel wasn't being the aggressor. They got invaded by 5 countries, and then they whooped them. And we end up with the third map, where you can see that Israel took territory in the east and in the south and in the north. And so we end up with these pieces called the West Bank, the green blob I'm looking at the third map. The green blob on the right is the West Bank. The green little bit on the left is the Gaza Strip. And up in the top right corner is the Golan Heights. And Israel got power over those areas. They don't want to administrate those areas, but they have them. And so, again, the map is propaganda because it calls that Palestine. But what's actually the case is Jordan was over the West Bank and Egypt was over the Gaza Strip. Now, that's something they won't talk about. Why? They only care if Israel is running things. If Jordan is running things, nobody cries about that. Why does Jordan have sovereignty over Palestine? Why does Egypt have sovereignty? Because they don't care about that. They only want the Jewish state to not exist where there are Jewish people. Pattern of Arab aggression continues. 1956, the Second Arab-Israeli War. The Fedayeen are carrying out terrorist attacks, bombings and shootings, etc., especially from Gaza into Israel. And so Israel drops paratroopers behind enemy lines and works their way back from Sinai into Gaza and removes all the Fedayeen bases and produces about a decade of relative safety. Meanwhile, in that decade, 1964, the Palestinian Liberation Organization is founded. 1964, So here's the question. From whom are you being liberated? Let's go back to the map. Jordan is occupying the West Bank. Egypt is occupying Gaza. Who are you being liberated from? What they're really saying is, we don't want any state of Israel. The Jewish state is not allowed to exist. And that was a stated core goal, is the elimination of the state of Israel altogether. Decades of terrorist activity, targeting civilians ensued. Hijackings, bombings, 1972 Olympic massacre, and many other massacres. Well, you ask, and we've covered this a little bit before, but was there any Jewish aggression? Yes. The answer is yes. I am not up here to say the Jews are always right and no Israeli has ever done anything wrong. Nothing of the sort. Since the formation of the Jewish state, there have been several instances of violence by Jews against Arabs that can be characterized as terroristic. But there's no comparison in terms of frequency or magnitude to the actions of the Arabs against the Jews. And more importantly, when these actions happen, they are roundly condemned by the Israeli government and by the people. In other words, when Jews do these things, Jews look at it and say, that's not the way. We condemn that. When the Arabs do it, they get voted into power. 1967 is the Six-Day War. Egyptian President Nasser evicted the UN peacekeepers from the Sinai Peninsula and Gaza Strip. He blockaded the Gulf of Aqaba. That is essentially an act of war because you have Israel's only port on the southern side is blocked. They allied with Syria and Jordan and Iraq, and they amassed forces on the border. Israel responded with a preemptive strike, wiping out 3/4 of Egypt's air force, and the war was over in 6 days. Israel wiped the floor and gained massive amounts of territory. Now, there was clear divine assistance throughout this war. There are multiple reports of angels, armies of angels, where the Egyptian and Syrian soldiers would look up and see armies of angels and they would put down their weapons. Multiple reports of that kind of thing. Now, here's a question for you, going back to last week. If the church replaced Israel and God's done with Israel and the Jews gave up on him, so now he gave up on them, why is he sending armies of angels to fight their battles in 1967? Sorry, just doesn't make sense. God is still the God of God's people, the Jews, and of God's people, the Christians. This is the territory they ended up with. They got the entire Sinai Peninsula and the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and the Golan Heights up in the top right. They ended up giving back. Notice the Sinai Peninsula is twice the size of their own country. They gave back the Sinai Peninsula they give it back. They gave back the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt at the Camp David Accords in a peace deal. After 1967 Six-Day War, the Arab countries met and they came to the conclusion, we're going to go with the 3 no's. No peace, no recognition, no negotiations. In other words, we don't recognize Israel as a country. It has no right to be there. There will be no peace. There will be no negotiations. How are you supposed to do business with that? Now, today, some countries have reversed course on this, and that's a praise the Lord right there. Egypt in 1978 formed a peace with Israel in the Camp David Accords. Jordan signed a peace with Israel in 1994. And most recently we have what's called the Abraham Accords. If you know anything about that, or if you don't know anything about that, 3 countries in particular, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Morocco, decided that they would sign a peace deal with Israel. And I do need to say a little something about that. Why are they doing that? Because they're recognizing, after decades of Israel acting right, they're recognizing Israel is not the problem. And they're recognizing who is the problem, which is Iran. And so these Muslim countries said, you know what? Israel's not the problem. Iran's the problem. And we're going to have some good commerce with Israel. There's going to be some good things coming out of a friendship with Israel. And so I am hopeful that more and more, notice the Palestinians is not part of this. They went around the corner, so to speak, and they said, let's go get some Arab nations that are not the Palestinians. There always was the case that they thought, we've got to solve the Palestinian question first. Then we can go get the rest of the Arab countries. And no, they came around, they said, that's not the way to do it. Let's go get some Arab countries who will come on board, and then later we'll worry about the Palestinian state. Kazakhstan is the latest addition just this year to the Abraham Accords. Good on you, Kazakhstan. Keep going. Look at all of these two-state solutions that have been proposed, accepted by the Israelis and rejected by the Palestinians over and over and over. And some of them were so ridiculous in terms of insulting to the Jews. First one in particular. Some of these, they gave them the moon and they said no. The Oslo Accords in the 90s was accepted by the PLO. That was considered an interim. They never got to a final phase of that. And so they did get to this plan called the Oslo Accords, which is where we get to our fourth map. And so for the last couple of decades, the green areas have had a measure of self-government. They get to vote in elections for not Israel's elections, in their own elections for their, and so they vote in the terrorists. In 2006, Gaza voted in Hamas. They voted in Hamas. You hear this stuff about all the extremists versus the moderates. You hear that? Oh, it's the extremists are bad. Well, they voted in Hamas. What does that tell you? Over 50% is what it tells me. Okay? Time doesn't permit us to go into all the stuff. But you have to ask yourself, 2000 and 2008 was complete ridiculous. They gave them everything and they said no. You got to ask yourself the question, why are these proposals being rejected? It's very simple. One side wants the other side dead. It's not about anything else. They don't want them to be there. They do not want to coexist. They do not want peace. Say, are you talking about everybody? No, I'm not talking about everybody. I know there are people that just want to live their lives and be left alone. But many are in this boat. More terrorism. We won't go into all of it. You've seen it on the news. More wars. And finally, we get to the 5 wars with Hamas in the last 2 decades. And every time Hamas would attack and Israel would go in and try to clean up and make things right, and then they would get pressured from the world. Oh, you're doing too much, you're doing too... So they would draw back. And then they get another attack, and then they go in again. 4 times this happened. Till finally on October 7th, the attack was so severe, it could no longer be ignored, and now Israel is in a place where they say, I don't care what the world says, we're going to take care of our business whether or not they like it. And so that brings us to October 7th in the current war. Israeli civilians were killed and kidnapped by Hamas, including American citizens. It's the worst terror attack since 9/11. Proportionally, if you talked about this happening on American soil, it would be the equivalent of 40,000 Americans killed and 8,500 Americans abducted. And they live streamed this with glee. Absolute evil. Absolute evil. And so the aftermath was Israel went to war again, and rightfully so. But now that brings us to, what do we do with the last 2 years? Because now our day and age is such that we don't know what to believe and who to believe. It's so difficult to discern what is true in our day. You have AI, you have all kinds of social media. People are very good at stating facts. And whose facts do you believe? Because one person will say a whole set of facts and say, my goodness, that sounds very bad for this one group. And then another person will state this other set of facts and it's complete opposite. And it's very difficult to know who to believe. It really is. Can I tell you that this is the new world and it's only going to get worse? And not just with the question of Israel, but with every question. It is going to be harder and harder for us to know what to believe, who to believe. And that's why we have got to know the Lord, know His word, know His people, and be built up in godliness and godness to be able to discern what's right and what's wrong, because it's going to get very difficult. It's already difficult. So what do we do when we don't know which information is accurate? The first thing I would say is default to biblical principles, if you can. If you know, if there's a biblical principle to default to, do it. In this case, support God's people. My default is I'm going to support God's people until something is so clear to me to give me a reason not to. That's my default. Number two, consider the track record of the parties. In this case, Israel and Hamas. What's Hamas's track record? Evil, violence, killing, terror. What's Israel's track record? I just gave it to you. You can believe it or not. Consider the character of the source. This one's difficult because it's hard to know the character of the source, sometimes the source of the information. But consider other statements by the source. If I hear the Young Turks giving me a list of facts that I'm supposed to believe about what's going on in Israel and Gaza, I have to look at that and say, the Young Turks stand for everything I stand against. Yes. Why would I believe their facts? But when somebody who I know that they stand for things that are right, I know that in other areas they stand for things that are right. Now when they come to this question and they're saying, we should defend Israel, or here's what's actually happening. I had a list of, sorry I didn't get this printed, but I had a list of facts from a source I would consider reliable. Israel continues daily 10-hour humanitarian pauses in Gaza City. In other words, they're bringing in aid, humanitarian aid. 2 million tons of humanitarian aid have come in. Anyway, you get the idea. They're claiming that Israel is starving the Gazans. I'm sorry, they're sending in aid. If it's not getting there, what can we infer about that? It's getting diverted. Guess by whom? If you're hearing people use the word genocide, you need to change your news source. Consider other statements by the source and rely on the Holy Spirit. I am not saying, what am I not saying? I am not saying that Israel is perfect. I am not saying that every Israeli citizen, every Jew is perfect. That'd be a ridiculous claim to make. And I'm not saying that all Arab Palestinians are evil. They're not. There are some who just want to live their lives and be left alone. But what I am saying is that overwhelmingly for 150 years, Israel has been on the side of right and on the side of decency and on the side of goodwill and deference. And all people, and especially Christians, should support Israel because of this. This is so obvious to me that failure to see it not only makes no sense, it makes what I've started to call anti-sense. Anti-sense. And anti-sense is a sure sign of the demonic. Only the demonic could create a deception so strong that it turns the clear and obvious upside down. Let me give you one example. Men can be women and women can be men. That is demonic. Why do I know that? Because it makes anti-sense. It doesn't just make no sense. Everybody knows that's so ridiculous. And yet people are buying into it in droves. And this is exactly the same thing. To buy into this nonsense that Israel has no right to exist and all the rest is absolutely demonic. And we need to reject it.